Tony thinks Max is an easy target, but what he doesn't know is that Max has a hidden side. When Tony pushes him too far, Max surprises everyone with a shocking response. What happens next will leave Tony and the crowd stunned, because strength doesn't always come in size. What's Max hiding? You won't believe how this standoff ends. Quickly comment from where in the world you are watching this video before getting deep into the story. It was a picture-perfect afternoon at Crestwood High. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, almost golden glow over the schoolyard, where students shuffled between classes, laughing, chatting, and running late to their next period. Max sat by himself, as he often did, perched on the steps at the far edge of the courtyard with a book in his hands. His usual retreat from the chaos. Max was the kind of kid who blended seamlessly into the background, slim, soft-spoken, always alone. It was quieter that way, and he liked it. The noise of high school life was like a storm he preferred to avoid. But for Tony, Crestwood's resident giant and king of bullies, quiet was a challenge. Tony, towering over most of the school with his muscle-bound frame and a swagger that could be felt a mile away, had a particular taste for picking on the quiet ones. And today, Max was his chosen prey. "Hey, bookworm!" Tony's voice boomed across the yard, a deep, thunderous sound that made students pause mid-conversation. His cronies flanked him, forming a near-impenetrable wall of laughter and mockery. "What's that, a novel about how to be invisible? Guess it's working. You don't belong here." Max didn't respond, his eyes never leaving the pages of his book. A few heads turned, curiosity piqued. This was always how it started, loud, public, and humiliating, but Max had learned long ago that responding only fed the fire. He was a ghost in their eyes, and he preferred it that way. Tony, however, was not content with silence. With the speed of a predator, he snatched the book from Max's hands and flung it onto the ground, sending it skidding across the pavement. The sound of the book hitting the concrete was almost drowned out by the collective snickers from the onlookers, a chorus of laughter that echoed through the schoolyard. Max didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. His gaze was fixed, unnervingly calm, on the fallen book, his only anchor to peace in this storm of noise. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, waiting for something to break, some visible reaction that would mark this as a victory for Tony. Tony leaned in closer, his massive shadow swallowing Max whole. "What's wrong? You're not going to cry, are you? What's the matter? Too quiet to stand up for yourself?" His voice was laced with mockery, a cruel, condescending tone that seemed to taunt the very air between them. "You're just a quiet little loser, nobody cares about you." Max didn't move. He didn't even blink. But inside, something was stirring, a simmering feeling that Max had pushed down for years, a feeling he knew all too well, the feeling of being pushed too far. A silent voice in his mind whispered, *enough. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was a quiet resolve, the calm before the storm. Tony, the big bully who could knock anyone around with ease, had just crossed a line Max had never thought to set. Max wasn't going to just sit there. Not this time. Tony's laugh rumbled as he stood back, hands on his hips, watching Max's reaction like a cat waiting to see if the mouse would run. But Max, in that moment, didn't look like prey. He looked like something else entirely. Then, without warning, Max stood up slowly, pushing the hair from his face with one hand as he reached down to retrieve his book. The crowd fell silent, confused. This wasn't the response they were expecting. Tony frowned, unsure of what to make of it. Max's voice, low but steady, finally broke the silence. "You think you're tough, Tony? Picking on people who don't fight back?" His words were soft but sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You don't scare me." The tension in the air thickened, and for the first time, Tony seemed unsure of himself. Max wasn't the easy target he'd expected. The crowd began to murmur, sensing something had shifted. The predator wasn't so sure of his victory anymore. Max took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Tony's. "I don't need to fight back," Max said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "Because you're the one who'll end up looking like the fool. So go ahead. Keep pushing. But know this, you're not going to win this time." A moment of pure silence followed. It was as if the entire schoolyard held its breath, waiting for the inevitable eruption. Then, Tony, his face a mix of disbelief and rage, took a step back. He'd never seen this side of Max before. And for the first time, Tony wasn't the one in control of the situation. Max didn't need to fight. He'd already won. The air was thick with tension, an electric hum that seemed to vibrate through every inch of the schoolyard. Tony's bullying was relentless, a barrage of insults and taunts that cut through the quiet like a knife. Each word was designed to wound, and the crowd that had gathered was a silent witness, eager for whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Max's back was against the wall, but his face betrayed nothing. No fear, no anger, just an unsettling calm. The students watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. Tony's voice boomed again, louder this time, as he shoved Max hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd gasped, expecting Max to crumble under the pressure, to retreat back into his shell. But Max didn't back down. His body went still, too still. It was as if time itself had slowed. He stood frozen, like a coiled spring, poised and ready, each muscle taut with restraint. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Tony, sensing the moment was his, grinned wide. His eyes were gleaming with triumph, already imagining Max on the ground, humiliated. "What's the matter, little man?" he jeered. "Afraid to fight back?" Max's body remained motionless for a beat longer, as though he were weighing his options. Then, he stood up slowly, the subtle shift of his posture making it clear this was no longer just about survival. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if every action was carefully measured. He brushed the dust off his pants in a motion so casual it almost seemed rehearsed, and then, without blinking, he locked eyes with Tony. "I'm not afraid," Max said, his voice low, yet carrying an unexpected weight. It wasn't a shout, nor a tremble of fear. It was calm. It was certain. The crowd shifted, a murmur of confusion rippling through the students. They had expected the same reaction they'd seen 100 times before, a cowering Max, desperate to disappear. But this? This was something different. Tony's grin faltered, just for a second, before he quickly masked it with a sneer. He stepped closer, towering over Max with his massive frame, determined to break the kid down. "Yeah, right," he sneered. "You really think you can take me down?" But Max didn't flinch. He didn't step back. His eyes narrowed, and in that split second, the world seemed to freeze, as if it was holding its breath alongside the crowd. Without warning, Max moved. His fist shot out like lightning, a blur of speed and precision. It wasn't wild or clumsy. No, it was calculated, executed with a clarity that was almost surgical. Max's fist collided with Tony's hand, knocking it aside with a force that left Tony frozen in disbelief. It wasn't a punch meant to harm, it was a punch meant to disrupt. Tony's mouth dropped open, his confidence shattered for a moment. The air crackled with shock. He had expected resistance, sure, but not this, not this quiet kid who seemed to have all the answers to his bullying. Max hadn't moved an inch, and yet he had rendered Tony's strike useless with a single, flawless move. Tony growled in frustration, his face contorted with rage. He tried to shove Max again, desperate to reassert control. But Max, now fully in command of the situation, was ready. With a fluid, almost graceful motion, he sidestepped Tony's lumbering attack, letting the bully's body charge past him. The momentum of Tony's own strength worked against him. Max's foot swept out, connecting with Tony's shin with a sharp, precise strike. Tony stumbled, his massive frame thrown off balance as he gritted his teeth, trying to regain his footing. It wasn't brute force that Max had used, it was strategy. It was fluidity, precision, and timing. Max had trained his whole life for moments like this, honing not just his body, but his mind. He knew Tony's moves before Tony did. And now, the bully was stumbling, not from pain, but from the sheer disorientation of being outmatched. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide with disbelief. Max, the quiet kid, had done the impossible. The bully was now the one on the defensive. Tony's eyes burned with fury, his arrogance faltering for the first time in years. He was not used to being the one on the back foot. Not like this. Max hadn't even broken a sweat. Max stood tall, watching Tony struggle to regain his balance. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost bored, as if he had known this was coming all along. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But Max wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to prove anything. He had already shown Tony exactly who was in control now. Max had turned the tables, and the bully's reign was over. Max's movements were like a dance, a seamless blend of control and calculation. The crowd, once jeering and taunting, now stood motionless, caught in a stunned silence. It wasn't just the strike to Tony's shin that had thrown them off, it was the way Max moved. There was no frantic scrambling, no flailing in panic. Every step, every motion was smooth, deliberate, almost effortless, as though Max had choreographed this moment long before it had come to pass. The calmness in his actions was unnerving. He wasn't just defending himself, he was taking control. Tony, the once feared giant of Crestwood High, stood there for a moment, dazed, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. The power he had so long wielded with ease was slipping away, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his own arrogance. Enraged, he swung at Max again, his fist a hammer coming down with the force of a wrecking ball. But Max was already behind him. There was no hesitation, no delay, just precision. Max's hands shot out, grabbing Tony's arm with a grip so firm it was like steel. The next second, Tony was on his knees, his massive body unable to withstand the pressure as Max twisted his arm in a lock that left him gasping in pain. The crowd watched in disbelief. Tony, the king of the school, the bully who could break anyone in half with a flick of his wrist, was now brought low by the quiet, unassuming kid they had all overlooked. The silence was so thick you could hear every breath being held in the crowd. Tony grunted, desperately trying to free himself, but Max's hold was unyielding, like a vice. It was clear, there was no escaping this. The giant was at the mercy of the kid he had so carelessly tormented. Max leaned in close, his voice low but carrying through the heavy silence. "Strength isn't about size," he whispered, his words almost a lesson, a truth being delivered. "It's about knowing when to fight, and how." The words hung in the air, reverberating off the school walls as Tony's face twisted with a mix of shock and humiliation. He had underestimated Max in every way, and now, here he was, the mighty bully reduced to nothing more than a captive to the very kid he'd spent so long tormenting. Without a word, Max effortlessly pulled Tony back to his feet, his motions smooth and controlled, never once breaking his focus. Tony's eyes were wide with disbelief, but before he could even try to right himself, Max was already one step ahead. With a swift motion, Max swept Tony's legs out from under him, sending the bully crashing to the ground with a loud, resounding thud. The crowd gasped, the sound of Tony's fall echoing in the dead silence. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. The reality of what had just happened was too much to process. The bully was down, and the quiet kid, Max, was standing tall, unscathed, and in control. Max stood above him, his gaze unwavering, calm as ever. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't reveling in Tony's defeat. He simply stood there, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about showing off. It was about sending a message. Tony, still reeling from the shock, tried to scramble to his feet, desperation clawing at him. But Max wasn't done yet. He looked around at the crowd, whose mouths hung open in disbelief. They had seen Tony dominate, humiliate, and break anyone who crossed his path. But now, in this moment, they were seeing something entirely different. They were seeing power redefined, a quiet strength that no one had anticipated. Max's eyes moved back to Tony, who was still trying to regain his balance, struggling to come to terms with the realization that he had just been beaten by someone he'd never given a second thought. Max's voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority. "Next time, think twice before picking on someone who's just trying to mind their own business." The words weren't a threat. They were a lesson. A warning. Max turned and began walking away, his shoulders squared, the crowd parting in silence as he passed. Tony stayed on the ground, staring at Max's retreating figure, his mind racing, his pride shattered. The crowd, still in shock, began to stir as Max disappeared into the hallway. Whispers filled the air, but no one dared speak too loudly, not yet. The world had just shifted, And in that moment, everyone knew things would never be the same again. Max had not only stood up to the bully, he had redefined what strength truly meant. The schoolyard was eerily silent. The usual hum of conversation, the chatter between friends, and the clatter of footsteps had all but vanished. The crowd, once eager to witness the downfall of the quiet kid, now stood frozen in stunned silence, their mouths agape, their eyes wide. They were struggling to process what had just unfolded before them. Max, the shy kid who had always kept to himself, had just done the impossible. Tony, the giant bully who ruled the school with his fists, was lying on the ground in defeat, utterly humiliated. It wasn't the brute strength of a fight that had taken Tony down, it wasn't even the physical pain. No, what had shattered Tony's pride, what had truly broken him, was the realization that he had been defeated by something far more powerful: skill, precision, and pure willpower. Max hadn't needed to overpower him. Max had outsmarted him at every turn. And now, in this very moment, the schoolyard saw the bully as he truly was, vulnerable to the quiet force of someone who had simply had enough. Max calmly bent down, almost ceremoniously, to pick up his book, the one Tony had so carelessly thrown to the ground. He dusted it off with the same steady, unhurried motion as if what had just happened wasn't even worth a second thought. As he stood back up, he glanced around at the stunned faces of his classmates, his expression neutral, almost serene. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking away, leaving behind a trail of silence in his wake. The students parted without question, instinctively stepping aside as Max passed by, their gazes locked on him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. No one had expected this. No one had expected Max, the quiet kid, to be the one to bring Tony to his knees. Tony, on the ground, slowly began to push himself up, wincing from the bruising on his arm. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if his body itself was still trying to process what had happened. The arrogance, the confidence he had always worn like armor, had crumbled in an instant. He rubbed his sore arm, trying to regain his composure, but the damage was done. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in. The world had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. The students watched Tony, some with pity, others with curiosity, but none with the same awe that had once surrounded him. He wasn't the king of the school anymore. That title, it seemed, now belonged to someone else entirely. And it wasn't because Max had taken it, it was because Tony had lost it to his own arrogance, lost it to the quiet strength of the kid he had tried so hard to push down. Tony's gaze flickered to the ground, then back to Max's retreating figure. It was a look of defeat, one that carried with it the weight of realization. He had been beaten by someone he'd never even thought to respect. Max had stood there, calm and unyielding, when everyone expected him to crumble. And now, Tony understood, strength doesn't always come in the form of size or aggression. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who carry themselves with quiet confidence, the ones who don't need to shout to be heard. Max hadn't needed to say a word, hadn't needed to prove anything. His actions had spoken for him, loud and clear. He had shown the crowd, and Tony, that strength comes in many forms. It could come from a quiet determination, from knowing when to fight and when to step aside. It could come from being true to yourself, no matter what anyone else thought. And now, everyone who had once written Max off as insignificant could see the truth. As Max walked away, the crowd remained still, unsure how to react. It wasn't just that Max had won, it was how he had won. He had transformed in front of their eyes from a quiet, overlooked kid into something far more powerful than any of them had ever imagined. Tony would never be the same again. Not just because of the beating, but because he now knew, in a way that no one had been able to explain to him before, that strength comes from within. And in that moment, Tony understood that there were far more dangerous people in this world than he'd ever realized, and Max was one of them. The bully had learned the hard way that sometimes, the quietest kids are the ones you should never mess with.